What if Napoleon had won at Waterloo? It's a question that has fascinated historians, writers, and dreamers for 2 centuries. Imagine it for a moment. The muddy fields of Belgium in June 1815. The cannons thundering, the French cavalry charging, and the Duke of Wellington's army beginning to falter. In our timeline, the French were crushed, Napoleon was exiled, and Europe entered a century of relative peace under the dominance of Britain and its allies. But what if instead the tricolor had flown victorious over the battlefield? What if Napoleon's genius had prevailed one last time? Would the world we know today even exist? To understand this alternate history, we must first remind ourselves of just how high the stakes were at Waterloo. Napoleon had already been defeated once before, in 1814, and sent into exile on the island of Elba. Most men would have accepted their fate, but not Napoleon. He escaped, returned to France, and in a matter of weeks, rallied his people and rebuilt an army. Europe panicked. Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia formed the Seventh Coalition to put him down once and for all. His only hope was to strike fast, to split his enemies before they could unite and defeat them one by one. Waterloo was the climactic gamble of his entire career. In reality, the day went against him. Delays in attacking, the stubborn defense of the British at Hougoumont and La Haye-Saint, and the timely arrival of the Prussian army under Blucher sealed Napoleon's fate. But if even a few details had been different, if Grouchy had stopped the Prussians, if Ney had coordinated better, if the French attacks had broken through earlier, the story might have been rewritten. So let's turn history on its head and imagine. Napoleon wins Waterloo. What happens next? The first consequence is immediate and dramatic. Wellington's army, exhausted and battered, collapses. The British retreat turns into a rout. The Duke of Wellington himself may be captured or killed, shattering British morale. Without the British holding their ground, the Prussians find themselves isolated, arriving too late to save the day. Napoleon, victorious, stands on the field once again as master of Europe. His army marches into Brussels. Panic spreads across the continent. But a victory at Waterloo does not end the war outright. The coalition powers still exist, and Russia, Austria, and Britain remain formidable. Yet a French victory would completely change the diplomatic landscape. European monarchs had assumed Napoleon was finished, a broken man. His triumph would force them to reconsider. Some states, like Bavaria, Saxony, and parts of Italy, might switch sides back to France. Fearing his wrath, or tempted by promises of reward, the Seventh Coalition could fracture before it even has a chance to regroup. At home, the political effect would be enormous. Napoleon had returned to power in France with the support of the people but under suspicion from elites. A resounding victory would silence his critics, rally the French nation, and restore his aura of invincibility. The legend of Napoleon, the man who could never be beaten, would burn brighter than ever. Instead of being remembered as the fallen emperor, he would become the triumphant conqueror who defied all odds. But let's push this further. What would Napoleon do after Waterloo? His strategic aim was not endless conquest, but survival. He knew France could not fight the entire continent forever. His hope was to force his enemies to the negotiating table, to secure recognition of his rule in exchange for peace. If Waterloo had gone his way, he might have marched on Brussels, perhaps even threatened Amsterdam or Hanover, to intimidate Britain and its allies. A decisive military success could have convinced Austria and Russia that continued war was too costly. And what of Britain? The British government had invested everything in stopping Napoleon. But a crushing defeat at Waterloo would have shaken public opinion. Britain's armies were small. Its strength lay at sea and in financing coalitions. If Wellington's army were destroyed, Britain might have struggled to raise another force quickly. The people, weary of 20 years of war, could have pressured Parliament to consider negotiations. A Europe where Britain is sidelined diplomatically would look very different from the world we inherited. Now imagine Napoleon consolidating his power in France after Waterloo. He might have restored his reforms, the Napoleonic Code, merit-based administration, educational institutions, and centralized government. These were achievements that shaped modern Europe. With more time and power, perhaps he would have expanded them further. Could France have become the dominant power of the 19th century, eclipsing Britain's eventual empire? Could the French language, not English, have become the global lingua franca? But hold on, before we crown Napoleon the ruler of the modern world, we must consider the limits of his power. Even with a victory at Waterloo, challenges remained. Russia's vast armies were still intact. Austria, though shaken, was not defenseless, and Britain's navy remained supreme, able to blockade France and disrupt its trade. A single victory might not have secured a lasting peace unless Napoleon could string together more successes. Yet his genius lay in turning victories into opportunities, and this was his moment. Let's play out two possible alternate timelines. In the first, Napoleon's victory convinces the coalition to sue for peace. Europe, exhausted after 2 decades of war, accepts his rule. France remains dominant, and Napoleon turns his attention to domestic affairs. Industrialization, which was beginning to transform Britain, now accelerates in France as well. French influence spreads across Europe, not just through conquest, but through culture, science, and economics. The 19th century becomes a French century, with Paris, not London, emerging as the global hub of finance and politics. Colonial expansion follows, with France securing territories in Africa and Asia before Britain can fully dominate. The balance of global power shifts. The world we know, with English-speaking superpowers, might instead have been shaped by French dominance. In the second timeline, Napoleon wins at Waterloo, but overreaches. Instead of peace, his enemies regroup. Russia mobilizes its vast manpower, Austria rallies its forces, and Britain pours money into yet another coalition. Napoleon, forced into a prolonged struggle, cannot sustain his momentum. His empire fractures under the strain. France bleeds itself dry in endless wars. And eventually the coalition prevails, but perhaps not until years later, with millions more dead. In this version, Napoleon's victory only delays his downfall, making the final collapse even more catastrophic. But let's think bigger. What about the Americas? In our timeline, Napoleon sold Louisiana to the United States in 1803, setting the stage for America's westward expansion. If Napoleon had survived longer in Europe, he might have regretted that sale. Could a resurgent France have tried to reassert influence in the Americas? Perhaps through alliances with Latin American independence movements? What if France, not the United States, had become the dominant power in the Western Hemisphere? It's a tantalizing thought. And what about the rest of the world? Britain's empire rose in the 19th century, largely because Napoleon was defeated, leaving Britain unchallenged at sea. If France had remained strong, British expansion might have been checked. India, Africa, the Pacific, these might have seen far greater French influence. The British Empire as we know it may never have existed in the same form. Instead of Queen Victoria's empire, perhaps history would remember Emperor Napoleon II, Napoleon's son, presiding over a French-dominated global order. Of course, alternate history is never simple. A Napoleonic Europe might have delayed or altered major events we take for granted. The unification of Germany under Prussia might never have occurred. Since Napoleon's victory would have kept German states under French influence, without a strong Germany, would World War I ever have happened? And if the 20th century never saw those great wars, how different would the modern world look? Would the United States have risen to superpower status without the world wars to propel it? Would the Soviet Union even have existed if Russia had developed differently under Napoleonic pressure? There's another angle to consider: ideology. Napoleon carried with him the legacy of the French Revolution, ideas of meritocracy, secular governance, and nationalism. If he had remained in power, these ideas might have spread even further and faster across Europe, reshaping monarchies and aristocracies. Instead of the slow march toward liberalism and democracy in the 19th century, we might have seen a Europe transformed much earlier, with revolutionary ideals embedded in its foundations. But then again, Napoleon was also an autocrat. His rule concentrated power in his own hands, and his empire was not exactly democratic. Would his continued reign have strengthened the idea of enlightened despotism, rather than representative government? Would the 19th century have been one of strong emperors and centralized states rather than parliaments and constitutions? The legacy of Napoleon winning Waterloo is not just about borders and armies. It's about the very political DNA of the modern world. Ultimately, the question, what if Napoleon won at Waterloo, is not just about one battle. It's about the path not taken in human history. Our timeline gave us a British-dominated 19th century, an industrial revolution centered in England, and eventually a world order led by English-speaking powers. But another roll of the dice might have given us a French century, different balance of empires, and perhaps a world where Paris rivaled London and New York as the global center of gravity. So was it possible?
Absolutely.
Napoleon was within a hair's breadth of victory. A single order, a single maneuver, a single moment of hesitation could have tipped the balance. History often turns on such knife edges. And if it had turned differently in June 1815, the ripple effects might have reshaped everything from colonial empires to world wars to the languages we speak today. And yet, perhaps Napoleon's greatest legacy is not in what might have been, but in the fact that we still ask this question 2 centuries later. His story, his ambition, his near miss at Waterloo remind us how fragile history is, how easily it could have been otherwise. Napoleon lost Waterloo, but in the realm of imagination, he continues to win it again and again, because in the end, the fascination with what if is not just about Napoleon. It's about us. It's about wondering how different choices, different fates, different battles could have reshaped the world we live in. And that, perhaps, is the true power of history, not just to tell us what was, but to spark our imagination about what might have been.